Good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming on this very, very rainy day in Vienna. We'll launch our book today, so I have it here in my hands, Reinvigorating the United Nations. And I want to tell you a little bit about how it came about and a little bit about what's in there. And then after 10 minutes or so, then we'll simply do a little roundtable discussion, and you're obviously more than invited to join in with your questions, comments, whatever you have. The book I co-edited with Sławomir, who you have sitting there on your right-hand side from you. And I have to say that the title is entirely Sławomir's. So the idea of the project really is Sławomir's. So we sat down, and I think it was H5, somewhere over there, and with a couple of NGOs here in Vienna who study United Nations. And Sławomir said, hey, we really have to do something on reinvigorating the United Nations. And it was one of these typical debates about, well, so all kinds of crises, all kinds of problems in this world. And Sławomir put basically the positive twist on it, reinvigorating the United Nations. And then in January 2023, we organized a big conference. And there were almost everyone presenting at that conference also appears in the book. Some people didn't because given their professions, they can't write all that freely. So people who attended and really made important contributions to the conference, but they're not in the book. They include Gadawali, who's the Director General at the United Nations Office in Vienna, Piotr Hofmanski, who was at the time the President of the International Criminal Court, Volker Türk, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Pasquale Ferrara, Director General for Political Affairs and Security in the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Alexander Marschik, Permanent Representative of Austria to the United Nations in New York, Sashi Taro, Member of Parliament of India, Amandeep Singh Gill, UN Secretary General's Envoy on Technology, and Pablo de Graif, who, amongst other things, is a member of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Ukraine. So it was really a great gathering of scholars, of practitioners, and a very lively debate on a big range of issues. Most of which you find in the book as well. And as it is with all of these bigger endeavors, you need a lot of sponsors, and I really, really want to thank them for making this possible. Without them, there would have been absolutely no way. There was the Austrian Research Association, and quite a few of us are a member of a working group, a standing committee there. Irmgard is one of them. And the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, the permanent mission of Italy to the international organizations in Vienna, the Austrian Foreign Ministry, the government of Canada, and then we also cooperated with NGOs. There was the Academic Council on the United Nations System, ACUNS. It was RAUN, the Regional Academy of United Nations, and it was UNSA, the United Nations Studies Association. So it was really an attempt to bring lots of stakeholders, so to say, together. And I think it worked out really well. And a few things about the book now itself, and to some extent I'm referring to the introduction that Sławomir and I wrote, and also to the book itself. Why actually thinking about reinvigorating the United Nations? And I think there are at least 4 good reasons for that. So the first one is the UN has struggled for decades with ever-recurring deadly challenges. And that is for the most part intra-state conflict. And this ever-recurring, even by now, is you can look at certain places in the world and it happens over and over. So one of the photos there you have on the slide is from Darfur, the one in the middle. And that is a fairly current picture, and the skulls, that is the results, obviously, of the genocide that happened in Darfur in the mid-2000s. And as we all know, there is massive amounts of violence in Darfur again today. The Arab-Israeli conflict, Middle Eastern conflict, Israel-Palestine, Israel-Gaza, obviously again in the headlines. And the picture on the right is supposed to symbolize another really big problem, is the proliferation of weapons. Yeah? And note that the person who holds that weapon is a civilian, yeah, is not in a uniform or something like that, and that obviously is a real problem. Transnational organized crime, and all of that. Then another very good reason to study how to reinvigorate the United Nations is about the demands and the supply of global governance. So it's quite clear that we are facing, and humankind is facing more and more problems that can only be solved by, well, humankind as a whole. But it's very, very difficult for the United Nations to supply this kind of global governance. Yeah? In the mid-1990s, there was a commission on global governance, so there was a lot of enthusiasm, actually, optimism that something like that could come about. But it's very difficult. If you look at those photos, the one with the viruses and circulating around the globe, there's a picture that the World Health Organization used to galvanize support about the pandemic treaty. And we know now, obviously, that negotiations have stalled and perhaps at a future point, but it doesn't look that good, I would say. Global warming, climate change, probably don't have to say much more about it. The effects of it become more obvious every year. Migration with record numbers of migrants, refugees, and obviously there's a need to regulate that too somehow, but we're quite far away from that, despite having a little compact on something. Refugee conventions are very important, but if one thinks of the problem, need for governing it, then there are probably not enough instruments. There's a problem of the legitimacy of the United Nations as an institution. So if we look at peacekeeping endeavors, for instance, then oftentimes in our days, peacekeepers actually being targeted. So being a blue helmet no longer means that people are going to accept, okay, so you are an impartial arbiter. Much of this legitimacy deficit in public debates, at least, focuses on the United Nations Security Council and the composition of it. And that obviously prolongs a status quo from the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and the permanent members of the Security Council and everything. And that may not be all that legitimate in our world, yeah, where we have all kinds of rising powers, where power shifts, and amongst other things, it probably shifts away from Europe. And we obviously have quite a few permanent members from that continent on the Security Council. The other pictures are, if you look at some middle powers, basically, who make it into the Security Council as non-permanent members, then there are several usual suspects. The other graphic, the other illustration is about peace missions being dispatched by the Security Council, and you see that it's really going down from the 2020s, and the little that still happens in Africa, and for the most part they're smaller missions. And then the fourth good reason to study the reinvigorating the United Nations is that, of course, the United Nations is built on certain core principles, yeah, and one of them is territorial integrity. And it is also built on the assumption, United Nations is also built on the assumption that the permanent members of the Security Council are custodians of peace. They will really take care of peace. There won't be peace spoilers or something like that. And if we look at the conflict between the Ukraine and Russia, then obviously it's a very different matter. Yeah. So in other words, there's very little doubting, yeah, that the United Nations is facing a severe crisis, and because of that, we think it is very important to ask the question about how you can reinvigorate it. And then we we did that in the book, trying to depart from existing literature on the United Nations in 3 ways. Number one, we wanted to tackle this question about reinvigoration comprehensively. And comprehensively for us means 2 things. Number one, we inquire about how to consolidate the United Nations, so consolidate the key principles upon which it is founded, elaborate on it, so what steps, what institutional innovations are necessary, and number 3, to transform it, transformation more far-reaching than elaboration. The other bit about the comprehensive is we look at foregrounds and backgrounds of institutions. Institutional foreground is the kind of thing that we are used to when we think of institutions, being designed. So the Security Council, quite clearly, is obviously enshrined in the Charter, and there are certain rules and norms that it applies. Those are written down, they have been negotiated at some stage. So it's tangible, these formal institutions are tangible. But there are also institutions that are much less tangible. If you take trust, for instance. Trust you cannot write somewhere in a document, everyone ought to trust one another. That wouldn't work, right? So it's the kind of background, but the kind of background is important for the foreground institutions to work. It's a little bit like a standard operating system on a computer. That would be the background, and the software that runs on it would be the foreground. Multidisciplinary is important for us as well. So we have experts on international law, we have political scientists, we have medical practitioners, we have linguists, we have experts in criminology. So it's a big mix of everything, and that's important for us too, because in that way you can look at similar issues from different angles. And the third one is we want to bridge theory and practice. And even when you look at the round table here now, then you have some who tilt a little more towards the practice, some a little bit more towards the scholarship, and that was important for us as well. We then end the book and the conclusion with several recommendations on foreground and on background. And some of those recommendations, especially on the foreground, are probably quite straightforward. So first one is to fund existing institutions adequately. Second one, to not fragment existing institutions. So let's say if you have an international criminal court, use it. Don't come up with all kinds of additional courts. Adapt existing institutions. So we are living in the 4th industrial revolution, right in the midst of it. A digital revolution, so therefore you will have to adapt certain UN institutions. You may even have to anticipate about the kind of directions of this digital revolution and put rules in place that are then important for the future. You need to take justice seriously. Justice, if I remember correctly, is mentioned in UN Charter 15 times. So that is an important concept. With different connotations, legal, social. And the 5th one is to give voice. That is something that Mona was very strong in her chapter, so reminding us that when we look at the UN Charter, it starts with we the peoples. In terms of the background, re-establishing trust, very important in one of the chapters at the end towards transforming the United Nations. So at the moment we are living in an age where realpolitik, geopolitics and everything comes back quite forcefully. So re-establishing trust is a very important point there. Opening up communicative channels. And that's probably especially important between non-like-minded states. So nowadays there's oftentimes a thing, so the like-minded states get together, fine, but you have to build bridges between those who are not like-minded. That's probably a very important point. Revisit what counts as high and low politics. So the World Health Organization estimates that the corona pandemic killed about 20 million people. That's a lot. Yeah? So in other words, global health does not deserve to be on the very bottom of a hierarchy of issue areas in global politics. Yeah? But that's, for the most part, how it's still perceived, especially by many member states. Yeah? If one looks at grand strategies of states, especially the great powers, then security is on top, economics comes fairly close, and then at the very end somewhere there's then health, migration, and perhaps the environment. Understand problems holistically. Yeah? So if one looks at armed conflict, for instance, then there are often lots and lots of different factors. Yeah? So there is an economy of peace or an economy of war. The environmental factors, droughts, oftentimes exacerbated by global warming. And they're the kind of things that we look at traditionally as political scientists. Yeah? Leadership, ethnic cleavages, divides, religious divides, and so on. And we have to understand that holistically. And the 10th one is to bridge different worlds. So in a world that is more and more dependent on expertise, it's actually very important that these experts and political decision makers and diplomats can talk to one another. And if one thinks about the corona pandemic, for example, again, that was very, very important that medical practitioners can speak to diplomats, can speak to political decision makers. Yeah? And if one looks early on in the pandemic, then a lot of things went wrong there. In terms of political pressures on the emergency committee at the World Health Organization throughout January. Yeah? So it's probably also quite an important point. And the book is not the kind of book that is simply confines itself now to whatever scholarly debates and the latest theory or something like that. But really want to make an impact in terms of practical international relations as well. And there is an opening. And we did today a whole day workshop. So most of us from here, they have been here since 10 a.m. in a closed discussion. So there is the Summit of the Future in September. And there are 3 documents being prepared as we speak, all available as a first draft already, and you can check it out online. That's the Pact for the Future, the Global Digital Compact, and the Declaration on Future Generations. And so there is something in flux at the moment, and there is a moment of reflection, and we hope that in the book we can with the book we can contribute to discussions that have something to do with the Summit of the Future. So then, without any further ado, then I'm going to change roles. I'm not going to say anything anymore. I'm just going to sit down there and moderate. And perhaps as a first way of doing this, so we're going to do one round, and then we're going to invite you to ask questions and then make comments. Maybe one way is you've all contributed to the book. Thanks a lot for that. And maybe we're going to start with Sławomir, and feel free to elaborate a little bit on your chapter, what you've written, and make any comments. Raise any questions that come to your mind.
Thank you, Markus. Urban legend holds that Kofi Annan was asked what he thinks about the United Nations. And he replied like this: when I had started my work, after 3 months, I knew that the UN was good for nothing. After 5 years of my service, I thought that I know everything about the UN. And after 30 years of my service, I am still confused. And this is what leaves me also in the state of confusion to tell you what, to me, was most important. First, it was organizing this event in 2023 to really gather people who can say interesting, constructive things about the UN that is facing still, that is still in crisis. After that conference event that was held in this conference hall, we decided with Markus to publish 10 best presentations in the form of book by Routledge under the title Reinvigorating the United Nations. What Markus said, what are the recommendations from this book, I take only one, that is, take justice seriously. And in the chapter of that book that I wrote, it is exactly what I was trying to do by taking justice seriously from the top of the world, that it's meaning from the various United Nations standards and norms in crime prevention and criminal justice, down to the field, and to make it work at the field level. And I have developed an idea of a country in Africa that I called Subuntia, sub-Saharan African country. Think what could be done to apply the UN standards and norms to that particular African symbolic by name country. And I was particularly concerned about the corruption of judiciary. Corruption of judiciary that is quite a problem, not only in Africa, by the way, almost, well, in most of the countries. In Africa, the difference is that out of 54 African countries on the continent, only 3 are above the lowest threshold for the observance of the rule of law. Only 3. And the rest, 51, is below the threshold. So I was trying to develop a project idea that would help to reinforce the rule of law in that one particular country by looking into corrupted judiciary. What can you do about the corrupted judiciary when people lose confidence in the independence of judiciary, in the deliveries, in sanctions? And the corruption of judiciary in that country was simply very straightforward. Namely, judges were taking bribes for more, let's say, mitigated sanctions, and simply cashing on the money stashed by oligarchs in that country, and in return for this lenient sanctions, everything was, I would say, settled, except for the confidence in judiciary by the local population. So how to move the judiciary and how to do certain things about the local population that starts to believe in justice, to take justice seriously. How to make such a project working, that is by first upgrading the quality of the judicial service in that country, but also by satisfying not only by better sanctioning of those corrupted businessmen, that is, that they will receive what is due by the criminal justice system, but also what is due for locals to build their own life in their own places, in their own villages. That is how the funds that are allocated or that are confiscated by the court can make the way to the local level. Most, by and large, according to the United Nations implementation reports, these funds, when are returned to the country of origin from which they were laundered abroad to foreign banks, they stay in the capital. They stay in the capital. And they are redistributed one way or another. You know, for Good Morning, this is okay. But later, as far as the implementation of the conventions, United Nations Convention Against Corruption that speaks about the rule of law and anti-corruption, that's not good enough. So I have shown that this is possible. And I have shown with the model how things can work if one wants really to take justice seriously, according to the precepts of, according to the United Nations standards and norms in crime prevention and criminal justice. This is what I did, which I believe that would make some progress in the area that is completely devastated by corruption and by the lack of confidence in criminal justice system. So with this, that's why the title of this presentation, of this article that I wrote is Whose Law and Whose Order? It should be the United Nations law and the United Nations order, and it's possible to apply if we know how to do it and how to do it practically. I think that we are not doing this enough, so I hope that this model that I have tried to develop and propose will somehow be the way to counter corruption. Finally, of course, my interest was not really in the corruption itself. My interest, original interest, was in something else, in stopping from Africa irregular migration. Those people who are so dissatisfied and who lost confidence in criminal justice system, in justice, simply do not want to stay in Africa. They want to seek justice and better world somewhere else, in Austria, in the European Union, in some other class. What it means that those people who are really the middle class people in Africa are going to Europe and leaving no one behind who can simply build Africa as a middle class constituency. So what I am saying and keep on repeating is that in my personal view, I'm very much for regular migration. I'm very much against irregular migration. And the way of sorting one and another is shown by this example that I was trying to write about regaining the confidence in justice in Africa by locals and by the governments who should be more attentive to the local needs and build middle class in Africa. Thank you.
Sławomir, thanks a lot. And then we're going to move on to Irmgard.
And my name, Irmgard Marboe from the University of Vienna. And my subject that I teach and research on is public international law in general. But for this book, I was invited to use one of my special topics as space law, or the law of outer space, for a chapter in the book on reinvigorating the United Nations. So, of course, the open question here is why that? You know, why outer space law in such a book on reinvigorating is probably not so self-evident. But I think there are some explanations for that, why it's a good choice, and I thank you very much for having included it. Because the law of outer space, or when we look at the conduct of outer space activities today is representative to a certain extent to how our world functions today, and also the international community or so is influenced today. First, it's the role of technology. Yeah, the increasing role of technology, and it's amazing how quickly the developments change, and we have really amazing speed in development of new technology, and also accessibility, I must say, not only in the industrialized countries, but also all over the globe. This is one, and this, of course, is exemplified by outer space technology as well. And the second is, here in this phenomenon, the role of private actors. Let's say increasing role. Then when we look back, when the foundations of the United Nations, we thought of states, of course, as the main actors of international law and international relations, and so they interact and they shape the international relations. But we in our area date, let's say, the increasing role of private actors in around the year 2000. So when technology developed so quickly and rapidly and efficiently that it became always cheaper and cheaper, so that more and more companies could afford to enter in that area, and started to offer services on a commercial basis for television services and others. So they had customers, they could make money out of use of the outer space technology. And this has started around 2000, now we have 2024, and the last 20 years or so, this phenomenon has, been dealt with within the United Nations already. So the United Nations is certainly not surprised by that, but I'm grateful to the Secretary General that he took up in his common agenda this example, and I would say he appreciates that example of how the United Nations in that particular area were capable of including private activity. And let me tell you how. So in the United Nations has already a long-standing permanent committee on the peaceful uses of outer space. It started in 58, 59, just at the beginning of the space age after the launch of Sputnik in 57. So from the very beginning, the United Nations were there to discuss matters of the use of outer space, first on the technological side, so what is going on there, but also on the legal side. So we have the two aspects always together, technical and legal, and this is until today valid for the two subcommittees on the technical side and the legal side, and they are, since 1996, meeting here in Vienna. So we have the opportunity to observe very closely those meetings. And so they opened up already from the beginning to observers. So we have observers in the COPUOS. We have member states of the United Nations as full members, and they have voting rights and discussion. But they have included a group of observers, and the observers can be intergovernmental organizations like the EU, like the ITU, so ESA, European Space Agency, but also non-governmental observers. Organizations can be there as observers. That means literally in the room, sitting behind their nameplates and being part of the discussion. So of course the member states have their own role and their right to speak, but also always on the agenda is the right for non-governmental organizations and intergovernmental organizations. So we have an inclusive dialogue, and this leads to a vivid exchange on technical and legal matters in the two subcommittees and in the main committee. And I think the Secretary General now, when he talks about the Summit of the Future, in our common agenda, so outer space appears 25 times, which I found really interesting. And he has also issued a policy brief on outer space governance, and refers to also the report of 2023 of the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, which encouraged governance bodies to increase the use of procedures that more effectively include external experts in member state discussions, which is already taking place at the COPUOS, but he highlights that as a positive example. And this an inclusive involvement of private sector actors could ensure that technological advancement and operational requirements are duly taken into account. And outer space is particularly a good example for this possibility of including not only the dialogue. So this is the first we talk, but then we have the benefit of a quite particular legal regime of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which gives also legal obligations to states with respect, for example, to non-governmental actors. So there is responsibility for those activities under outer space law and liability for damage that happens as a consequence of an accident, either on the ground or a collision in outer space. And here is the possibility of including the state's roles with their responsibility of private actors. So they are, in a way, mixed together, and every state has then the obligation to authorize and continuously supervise the activities of private actors in outer space and takes responsibility for that. And this has worked for many years, and even now, nobody is questioning it. Even, we have, it's very recognized also by the United States and European actors, France, who has a lot of, also private actors. They authorize and supervise and know that they have this international responsibility. So the benefit of that is that you can use the innovation and flexibility of private actors, supporting them, but still leaving them not without any accountability, which is otherwise in other areas perhaps a problem. How do you hold companies, non-governmental actors, accountable for violations of international law? But we have that in outer space law. I think that's why the reason that why this is highlighted. But there's of course many things are more to do, and we have to. The Secretary General has a project proposal on more and better space traffic management. So this is certainly not ideal yet. There are no clear rules on space traffic in the increasing number of space objects. So he identifies 4 space-based challenges now: the space traffic coordination or management, space debris is an increasing problem, the number of space junk around and posing a danger, resource activities, and prevention of conflict in outer space. Also the space race, so it should not be a military race, arms race of weapons in outer space. And these 4 topics should be part of the summit, and the discussion perhaps of an outcome document could include these 4 topics on space traffic management. And this, let's say, vision and option gives perhaps an optimistic view also on other areas. And I have found a quote of Michelle Griffin. She's also an optimist promoting the Summit of the Future. And she also mentioned in her recent statement of June, beginning of June this month, that also she mentions that the outer space and better governance is possible with a combination of the work of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is a UN committee, and private actors. So with this, let's say, a bit positive tone, I would say there is a possibility of example to bring forward a better governance of global affairs, not leaving it only to private actors and not only to states, but finding a combination. And perhaps this is possible in the area of technology as a prime example, but perhaps in other areas as well.
Irmgard, thanks a lot. That would definitely help to reinvigorate the imaginations. That's true. And Mona, then you're the next speaker.
Very briefly, my chapter is the first in the book and is basically a report card on how well the UN has lived up to its own principles and purposes in the first quarter of the 21st century. And as I was about to say, you can imagine it's not a very good report card at the end of the day. The grade, because it's not just the UN in crisis, it's a world in crisis, and the UN reflects those fissures. The chapter is divided into 5 areas. that are being assessed, both good news and bad news. Peace and security, human rights, self-determination, and socioeconomic advancement of peoples, justice and the rule of law, as well as the peaceful settlement of disputes and the prohibition on the use of force. The UN has had several notable successes, so let's begin with those in this first quarter. Having the poverty rate in the world through the MDGs and SDGs, primarily because China has lifted so many people of its own population out of poverty, but that has had an impact on the global figures. Instituting the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council, I consider a success. Establishing the International Criminal Court, enshrining the responsibility to protect, increasing the resort to the International Court of Justice more in the last 20 years than in the entire 40 years previous combined, resurrecting the General Assembly's powers under the Uniting for Peace, as we see in the emergency special sessions for Palestine and Ukraine, and codifying further treaties, in particular counterterrorism and disarmament treaties, most recently the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. While the UN has so far successfully fulfilled its primary purpose of averting a third world war, we are nonetheless closer to the precipice than we have been in a long time. Today's world is visited by violent as well as non-violent threats, many of them threatening the very existence, as we see with the nuclear confrontation, with the climate change, with the rise of pandemics, and possibly also artificial intelligence, with civilians paying the highest price in conflicts all over the world. Humanity is facing, as we said, not one, not two, but three and possibly four existential threats, and the unity of purposes and the multilateral, the belief in the efficacy of multilateral solutions is at its lowest when it's needed the most. So the Security Council has recognized that all three of these existential threats have security implications, and even though they involve nonviolent threats, are nonetheless threats to international peace and security, and has made this announcement without the necessary investment in addressing. It's not necessarily looking for solutions, but it's looking for putting mechanisms in place, incentivizing positive behavior and de-incentivizing the behavior that contributes to accelerating the crises. So one of the greatest failures, of course, we have to acknowledge is the promise of the inalienable right to equality between men and women. When the millennium began, we had SDG 5, we had UN Security Council Resolution 1325 making all of these promises and goals and commitments to bringing in women to every phase of the spectrum of political conflict, from the prevention to the resolution to the governance to the peace building to the post-conflict scenarios. The results have been rather disappointing and possibly even disturbing. For at last count, we have less than 20% of peacekeepers are women, less than 15% of peace negotiators are women, less than 10% of signatories to major international peace agreements are women. Nonetheless, women and children continue to be the disproportionate majority or plurality of the victims of war, and also suffer the most as a result of the impact of poverty and hunger. Most disappointing of all is that we have yet to have a female Secretary General of the United Nations. So let's work to make sure that the next one is a woman. Nonetheless, in my view, the greatest distance between the UN's promise and today's reality is that the 4 out of the 5 permanent members have become, rather than the custodians of peace, as Markus refers, but rather the chief violators of the UN Charter. And as a result of their divisions, the Council itself is paralyzed. To me, the unraveling began with the US and UK invasion of 2003, Iraq. So when we talk about aggressors, we must also look to 2003, which is still part of this 21st century, and constituted 2 out of the 5 permanent members, not only committing an unjustified invasion, but also committing war crimes and torture, as we saw in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. So not only did they violate the framework, but their credibility to stop others from committing the same has been severely limited. And as a result, the Council too, its credibility, its legitimacy. So we need to use that as the starting point. Of course, this comes on top of the Russian invasions, not once but twice. 2014, not only with an invasion, but also with an occupation of Crimea, with very little consequence. The fact that the international community did not respond has engendered the second and more large-scale invasion in 2022. So 3 of the 5 are guilty of aggression and violations of sovereign territorial integrity. A 4th member of the P5, China, is committing serious human rights violations at a minimum, and possibly crimes against humanity. Some would even say possibly ethnic cleansing and genocide with the treatment of the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province. Also with very little attention or consequence. Now, we've seen the unprecedented terrorism of Al-Qaeda, the unprecedented barbarism and sexual slavery of Boko Haram, Lord's Resistance Army, and ISIS, unmatched. But we must also pay attention to the genocides against the Darfuri and Yazidi people, which took place in this century, and what is now the ICJ is deeming to be plausible genocides against the Rohingya in Myanmar and the Palestinians in Gaza. So these horrors have all revealed and amplified the distance between the promise of the UN Charter and the reality of today's world. All told, the Security Council has emerged as the biggest failure of the UN system and the P5 as the most consequential violators. The abuse of the veto by the so-called great powers violates their ergo omnes obligations under the Geneva Conventions and the Genocide Convention and paralyzes the Council from fulfilling its responsibilities. In light of this terrible, and in some cases terrifying report card, all states must unite to prevent further slide into chaos, crisis, and carnage. Out of self-preservation, not out of idealism, but out of self-preservation, we must work together to reinvigorate the United Nations, to restore faith in the power of principles, and to move away from the principles of power. Our fate as a human, and more importantly, humane race, rests on the member states' respect for these principles that they themselves embraced in the UN Charter, and their fulfillment of the promises they made in the UN 75 Declaration. This is not, in my view, an idealistic vision, but rather a practical imperative.
Mona, thanks very much. And then Adams.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Adams Bodomo. As you can see here, I'm a professor of African Studies on the chair of African Linguistics and Literatures at the University of Vienna. I come from Africa, from Ghana. When my friend Markus and Professor Edu asked me to be part of this project, I was wondering what a linguist should be doing among international relations people. So when I read their concept note, which was very well laid out, I already saw that I fitted into all the 3 major themes they were raising in terms of reinvigorating the UN. They describe the reinvigorating the UN in terms of consolidating, right? In terms of elaborating, and in terms of transformation. And in some of the work that I do, as I say, as a professor of linguistics and literatures, we look a lot we try to protect indigenous peoples. In a multilingual system, we have to ensure that everybody is part of the thing. And so when I looked at the UN Secretary General's, our common agenda, I saw in it an important note about not leaving anybody behind. So, inclusion. And yesterday, you guys went to the polls. You went to elect members for the EU. Were there any issues of language? Most voters were able to go and take the ballot or read through all the people's manifestos and things and chose which party you wanted. This is not the case in many parts of Africa and other parts of the multilingual, other countries with multilingual systems. So my topic is linguistic human rights for the promotion of democracy. Now, democracy, if we look at all that the UN has been doing, the UN has tried to promote democracy. Without democracy in many parts of the world, the UN cannot even be thinking about reinvigorating. Democracy is a cardinal value of European value and also of the UN value. So you cannot talk about reinvigorating the UN without attempting to develop democracy. So I entered at that point, and I said that for democracies, for us to include everybody in a country that is multilingual, we need to promote linguistic human rights. And linguistic human rights are attempts to say that everybody has the right to peruse and to access information in order to inform them to be, good citizens and citizens that can look at things and find a way to make their decisions or to vote and to have their voices heard. So linguistic human rights are very important. There is a concept of right of language and right to language. In other words, a government cannot say, hey, guys, everybody should do this language and forget about that language. Every community has a right of language. We must ensure that every community is able to use their own language to be able to access information. And we must also, there's also another aspect of the linguistic human right, which is the right to language. The idea that every human being, every person should have the right to access the language of power that can help them to develop. You may think that this is very easy in places like Europe, but it's not as easy in places like Africa. So I set about looking at how this is done in various places. And one thing was that it is not that governments have tried to do their best in language policies, but governments are not always very keen in promoting minority languages. One reason about this is that in many parts of Africa, ruling governments think that when you promote minority languages, you're also promoting ethnicity. You're promoting division, which is a lie. Us linguists think that these languages are resources for education. Teachers, educationists everywhere in the world would tell you that the best way to educate somebody is through their mother tongues. So I went, in my article, I started looking at how things are done. And I noticed something, the youth. The youth are using technology to help develop their own languages, which are called digital activism. So I take advantage of this notion of digital activism, and in my research, I looked around and saw what young people were doing to promote their languages and cultures. In line with the UN Decade of the promotion of indigenous languages, which started in 2022 and going all the way to 2032. So the UN has this background for the promotion of indigenous languages. As you can see, the UN, the UNESCO, and the UNESCO and other parts of the UN are very much interested in language development. So I looked at how individuals, not just government, but individuals are promoting this. And I surveyed a number of people in Africa, to different parts of the world, different parts of Africa, all the way from South Africa to Nigeria and to Ghana, my own country. Young people everywhere were doing all their best to promote, to write, to help their people to know how to write, develop dictionaries, develop grammars, and develop materials for the promotion of literacy. But then often academics are accused that you just study these things, but you don't do anything yourself. And I said, no, I'm not like that. I am in Vienna, but I have one leg in Vienna and one leg in Ghana. I go often. I have promoted myself, so I also did a case study of a project I did. And my wife, who is sitting there, knows about this project, which is Dagare Young, and only Dagare. We have developed a system, an online portal, a forum, both on WhatsApp and on Facebook, where we teach, we help try to assist people to write, to read and write, and develop literacies in our mother tongue, which is Dagare. And so we have pushed our own individual monies into it, and we have organized, writing competitions, literacy competitions, and young people win it. Some people win and get prizes and all this kind of thing. So I'm not just an armchair linguist. I'm not just an armchair professor at the University of Vienna. I am on the ground. I am in the trenches, and I describe this in my article, in my chapter. But as I say, the editors did a very good job. They laid out a very good, background, a very good concept note, mentioning all these types of how to invigorate the UN, and all of my work fitted into it. I guess that's why my chapter was also chosen as one of the chapters that was published. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adams, and thanks a lot to all of you for the quick for a quick overview. So we are one woman short now. Irmgard Marboe, she had to leave, but she said earlier it's great that she could make it anyway. And so let's move into questions and answers. And I think I'm also always going to bundle 3 questions at a time. So whoever wants to go first, go for it.
Hi, my name is Tamina Huber and I'm a student here. First of all, thank you very much for being here and talking about this very interesting project. I want to direct my question to you, Professor Bodomo, because I really resonate with your topic, the rights to language. In Austria, there are about 700,000 people who need simple language, but still have a right to vote. There's a huge lack of information for them, which is tailored to their language level. I was wondering how seriously is this taken of a right to language taken on a UN level? Is there some progress being done in the Summit of the Future on this topic? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Sophia. I'm also my student too here. My question will be more general, I guess, for each one of you regarding trust. And so what's your view in rebuilding trust among different stakeholders in the UN? How do you secure that, every voice is heard and respected?
Thank you.
Thank you also from my side. My name is Milana, I'm also a Master student, and I have 2 questions for all of you, if I may. So, first of all, how could the UN improve its role in global peacekeeping, particularly in light of current conflicts and the changing nature of warfare? And my second question would be, how would potential reforms within the Security Council impact the current global order, particularly in terms of power distribution among states? Thank you.
The last question was about the Security Council, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, Security Council reform. Yeah. Good. Then thanks a lot for the questions, and perhaps Adam, we're going to start with you, and then wander around this way because one was explicitly addressed to you.
Thank you very much. Your question is right there. The right to language, as I said, is very important. You were talking about that in Austria there are some people. I was thinking that, I had a very positive idea that, no, there's no problem about right to language in Austria. But it seems your question is saying that, actually, we could also do something more, right? And your question then went wider into the UN, yeah. How is the UN doing this? As I said, the UN has been establishing some programs, and I just mentioned the UN Decade for the promotion of indigenous languages, right? It's ongoing now, and in this decade, in this program, the UN is trying to encourage everybody, so that languages don't die, and minority languages don't die. So I think that in that sense, the UN has a hand in trying to help, promote this idea of right to language. But I don't think that is enough in many other parts of the world. I have lived in many parts of the world, in Africa, here in Europe, in the US, and in China. And governments don't sometimes think that this is not necessary. In fact, they want everybody to have this idea of a national language. So I think that there's something being done, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I'll talk to you later about what you mean by there are some people in Austria don't still have the right to language. You can teach me. I don't know about that. Thank you.
No, thank you, yeah. Mona. There was actually in the workshop that we had beforehand, there were quite a few of those questions that Mona addressed very well already, but it's great for the audience.
The question of trust, I think, is at the heart, because as I mentioned earlier, those who are perceived to be the guardians or the custodians of the system are themselves losing credibility. Their own actions have betrayed the very values that they are meant to be promoting. After all, the Permanent Five were the original authors of the Charter. Their leaders at the time were the ones that created the system, again, not out of idealism, but out of self-preservation, because they saw the horrors of World War II, the horrors of the Holocaust, and wanted really to put in place certain minimum standards of human behavior, both as states' responsibility to their citizens, but also states' responsibility and rights vis-a-vis each other. So when we talk about upholding the Charter, it's not about being moralistic or idealistic, it's about being practical. It's about being a path to survival, a path to self-preservation, as humans, as individuals, as well as the collective nation. So in order to rebuild that trust, we have to rededicate ourselves to those foundational principles. We have to believe in those principles, not just, international law doesn't matter because it's being violated. Well, domestic law gets violated as well. We don't say that doesn't exist. That's why we have courts, police, prisons, and so on and so forth. Justice isn't always evenly handed out, but justice needs to be, begins with the enforcement of law, which means you have to believe in the force of law and the efficacy of law and then take the steps to enforce it. Again, the failure of the council, because that's where the enforcement should be. So it's kind of what I like to call a virtuous cycle, that by fixing one problem, you're actually fixing other problems as well. By reminding the permanent members that they're not in a position of power, they're in a position of responsibility, that their behavior has to accord with the very charter that they are calling upon others to uphold. They have a veto, but they cannot abuse the veto. They need to be aware of their other obligations. It's not the only instrument. And it's certainly the least of the instruments. The Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Conventions, are as high, if not higher, principles and obligations that must be also respected. So when they stop the Council from reacting to a genocide or responding to an aggression or responding to mass atrocity crimes, they are violating not only the Charter, they're violating their own obligations under customary international law, and preventing the Council from fulfilling its responsibility. So knowing that the Council can act is part of trust. When it fails to act, we lose that trust. The General Assembly has resurrected itself, I would like to say. It revitalized itself. It can go much further. Instead of just passing resolutions that condemn, it can actually use Uniting for Peace to impose sanctions, to create peacekeeping missions, to create referenda, to create protection of civilians' forces, to call upon those to implement ICJ and ICC orders. They can't make it obligatory, but they could certainly give the legal basis for those who want to act. States who want to give military assistance to Ukraine, states who want to impose sanctions on those who are perpetrating the violations. So those who are willing and able to act can act with legal basis from the United Nations, better than acting alone through ad hoc coalitions or through humanitarian intervention, which violates the Charter. Last but not least, civil society can hold accountable. We need to tell them we expect more of them, and we need to name them and shame them when they fail. So the fact that we wash our hands and say, oh, there was a veto, there's nothing we can do, there's plenty we can do. There's the Uniting for Peace in the General Assembly, there's public accountability, there's boycotts through economic decisions not to purchase certain products. There's many, many things. Civil society was responsible, finally, for the establishment of the criminal court. We see its impact. For the member states to take climate change seriously. Many, many things are as a result of civil society engagement. So we have a responsibility too. Last but not least, and I'm not going to talk about it because there's too much to talk about on the reform side, but I can refer you to a report that I prepared, and I'm happy to give you the access. But you can look it up under UN Association for of the United Kingdom. And Together First, it's a report on how you can reform the Council to be more effective without amending the Charter.
I want to thank you. Sławomir, do you want to add anything?
Okay. Look, I'll take my prayer book now. And read you one sentence.
The microphone.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Now, okay. So, this is my prayer book.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you very much. I read you one sentence from that prayer book. In hindsight, we should have put the establishment of the rule of law first, for everything else depends on it: a functioning economy, a free and fair political system, the development of civil society, public confidence in police and the courts. This is what was said by the UN administrator in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he gave the interview to New York Times in 2002, and he said so. In the hindsight, because he was the administrator, I think, in 92, 96, and then his reflection, sort of when he retired, was this: I don't see any other way of regaining the confidence in justice and in the United Nations if we really do not start doing things at the local level. What Professor Marboe said, referring to the director of the Summit of the Future, Mrs. Griffith, she said something in the interview that was very interesting. People are not really interested about the reform up there of big bodies, you know, whether this is General Assembly, whether this is Security Council. They are interested in daily lives and how they proceed about their legitimate business in their daily lives. And I really think that the way to start genuine reform of the UN is live by the UN standards and norms at the local level. And then, like that was Paddy Ashdown's reflection, start really applying this with little things at the local level, with courts, with police, with corruption, with things that are really bothering us daily. And I think that we really should know how to do it ourselves with our own hands, with our own initiatives, with our own life chances. You know, taking the law into our into your hands and making it work, this is, to me, the art of making justice in the world. Not only by voting at the General Assembly for something and something, and forgetting about its implementation at the local level. So I just keep on arguing about this because I see that the UN is sort of, in, let's say very gently, in a non-linear way of development, with ups and downs, and perhaps we are now really at the slopes that are going a bit down with reinvigorating the United Nations as such. I don't know what will happen with the summit of the future. Perhaps there will be this momentum finally. You never know. In politics, everything is possible. Everything is possible. So we have these few months and to see whether there will be this energy to reinvigorate the United Nations in September. I would very much encourage you to watch what will be going on at the UN on the 22nd and 23rd of September this year. I'm sure this will be televised, you know, on the web and everything around. And you, as sort of members of civil society, really definitely will have your say. I heard today a very interesting idea of having a new commission on youth, giving the succeeding generation the right really to speak out and to express their own interests. I think it's very important that the UN, with all these commissions, functional commissions that it has, and it has many, it will give this voice to youth. And I know from at least UNODC, with which I was working for a very, very long time, that there are youth assemblies concerning the prevention of crime and the treatment of offenders and organized crime and everything. So that's the way to go, but definitely this is just for good morning. I really think that also the Summit of the Future should recognize these voices of the youth and give really a place and a way to express themselves in terms that it will be really valid, not just a soundbite. Thank you.
No, good. And I think there's one question that we didn't. I'm just jumping very quickly about the peacekeeping. Yeah. So that's obviously a very important point. And so we have a chapter in there by Eugene Chen and Katharina Coleman, which is entitled "Reinvigorating United Nations Peacekeeping," because that is really in need of being reinvigorated. And in our discussions today, we had one presentation on peacekeeping, and we had quite a few discussions, and there were people from New York also zooming in, and so perhaps in the Pact for the Future, we're going to find a few things there about peacekeeping as well. It's quite clear if one looks at figures and everything, peacekeeping missions being deployed and everything, then it hasn't been looking good in recent years, to put it mildly. Adam, sorry, you wanted to.
I was just saying, I mean, I answered a specific question, but I also have a take on the general question that was asked about trust. I think that, you know, the way that we can develop and improve on trust is inclusion, which the UN Secretary General mentioned, and representation. For example, the five permanent members. I'm sure my fellow people in the Global South have been clamoring for this particular institution to be reformed. I mean, that five, I mean, why can't we expand it, or if at all we want to have it? Should we do away with it, or should we either do away with it or we should expand it so that it is more inclusive of other parts? I mean, how can a country like India, with 1.4 or so, not be part of the UN, I mean, permanent? And also in terms of languages, how is it that not a single African language is among the UN languages? So I think inclusion is very important, and representation are important.
Yeah, definitely, for I mean, especially for legitimacy's sake, I think, yeah. Okay, then thanks a lot for your questions, for your comments. If you want to continue to discuss, we can do that on a one-on-one basis. And yeah, and then enjoy the rest of your evening. And thanks a lot for being here.
Okay.